Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast brings you stories and wisdom about life in law enforcement, giving support and encouragement to those who wear the badge. Today, I'm talking to Paul Bowman, who was the department range master in the 1980s when the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department transitioned from revolvers to semi-automatic handguns. This transition from over 100 years of one type of gun to a completely different type is actually one of the biggest changes in law enforcement history. In less than one generation, over 15,000 departments and agencies changed from primarily carrying revolvers to primarily carrying semi-autos. And with change comes fear, resistance, and growing pains. Paul and I made an effort here to talk about guns in a way that is accessible to non-shooters. I want people who are unfamiliar with some of these guns and their histories to be able to follow along, while still giving experienced shooters enough new information to keep them engaged also. And I think we did a pretty good job of it too, although I had a hard time reining in my enthusiasm. Paul is just one of those guys with whom it's fun to talk about guns. He's knowledgeable, he keeps up with the cutting edge of technology, and he was actually there when the big changes happened. Here's Paul Bowman. Hello, Paul. How are you doing today?
Doing just fine, thank you.
Excellent. I'm glad that you're here today. I wanted to talk to you about the transition from revolvers to Glocks and what that looked like in a police department, specifically the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. So let me start out by maybe defining some of our terms. When someone says a wheel gun, not a real gun, but a wheel gun, what's that mean?
That's a revolver because it has a round cylinder that's like a wheel that spins around.
Okay. How many shots?
It depends. Some of them are 6-shot, but some of the smaller ones, like what detectives would carry, were only 5-shot.
Okay. And with these revolvers, they don't have a safety, right?
No.
Okay, so you pull the trigger, it goes bang.
Pull the trigger, it goes bang.
But it's a heavier trigger pull. What does that mean?
It takes more strength to pull the trigger, and it's a longer trigger pull.
Okay.
Unless you cock it first.
Okay.
And if you cock it first, then it's a real light trigger pull. It's two different trigger pulls.
This is the difference someone might hear at times that referenced single action versus double action.
Exactly.
Double action is where the trigger pull pulls back the hammer and then releases it again.
Single action is when you cock the hammer, and then you got a real light trigger pull.
Okay. So if the hammer is pulled back first, then just hardly any effort at all makes the gun go off.
Exactly.
But if the hammer's up, it's actually a really long, hard pull.
Yes.
That's not going to happen on accident.
No. No.
And so there's not a mechanical safety, but there is kind of a built-in safety element to it because it's hard to pull the trigger.
The main safety on revolver is the person that's got it.
Okay.
It's the person themselves. There are built-in internal safeties that keep the weapon from going off accidentally, like if you drop it or something.
Right. Okay.
But as far as any other safety, it's the individual himself.
Okay. And then a semi-auto, what is different about a semi-auto? Let's just kind of work our way down the list here. There's not a cylinder.
No.
Okay.
No. A semi-auto has a magazine that fits in it, multiple round magazine. You put a round in the chamber, and every time you pull the trigger, it fires that round, and it'll reload another round in the chamber.
Most semi-autos, the top of the gun slides back and forth.
Slides back and forth.
And ejects the spent casing and loads a new round.
Loads a new one in.
Okay. How many shots are in the magazine, typically?
Typically 12 to 15, depending on the size of the gun. Some of them have as many as 18 rounds.
Okay, so twice, maybe even 3 times as many as a revolver.
Exactly.
Okay, that's important. Now, trigger pull with a semi-auto, they're not typically quite as heavy as the revolvers.
They're not nearly as heavy, and the length of the pull is a lot shorter on a semi. as compared to a revolver.
So that gun, the trigger pull's lighter. It goes off a little easier.
Yes.
Some of them have safeties, mechanical safeties.
Yes.
But some of them don't, right?
Yes.
Okay. And very famously, the Glock, which is almost your stereotypical police gun, it does not have a external safety.
It does.
Okay. Explain that.
It does. On the trigger, there's a centerpiece on the trigger.
Okay.
That centerpiece, you have to have your finger on the trigger, and that piece has to be pulled back in order to pull the trigger on back. You can get a hold of the sides of the trigger, and you can't pull it back unless you depress that little centerpiece.
So you can't drop it or gravity or the wind or anything else. That's not possible to pull that trigger.
You have to physically have your finger on the trigger and pull it back.
Okay. And so the two guns are quite a bit different. And of course, the semi-autos are a little more recent invention. I mean, I suppose you go all the way back to the early, turn of the century, 20th century, when you start seeing semi-autos of different types. And of course, the 1911 style, World War I,
yes.
U.S. Army gun. I mean, that's very common. But the Glocks that were made largely, the lower part of the gun is made out of plastic. That's more recent.
Yes.
And so the tried and true technology of the six-shooter, the revolver, the wheel gun was long established before these polymer plastic semi-autos came around in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So how did Kansas City, Kansas Police Department move from the tried and true technology to this newer stuff?
Well, it was a result of the criminals, the bad guys out there. It became quite apparent that the police officers were outgunned. A lot of the bad guys had semi-automatic handguns, they had rifles, everything else. And we were still dealing with 6-shot revolvers.
Okay.
And it became apparent we were outgunned and thought it was time that we get caught up a little bit for the protection of the officers and of the people themselves.
Okay. So what year did you come on the force?
I came on the department in June of 1967.
Okay. And at what point did you start hearing talk of transitioning to something more modern?
We started hearing talk of other departments doing it probably about 85.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
You could hear where some departments were starting to transition and reading a lot and stuff on it. And we really didn't get involved into the transition until I think it was early 88.
Okay. What were some of the factors? I mean, you mentioned that the police sometimes felt they were outgunned. But what was the problem with the old reliable revolver? What were the negatives there?
They were good weapons. Of course, like with any other thing, you have to take care of them. Mm-hmm. But they were good for 6 shots. And if you needed more than 6 shots, it took time to reload.
Okay.
And sometimes you didn't have that time.
Okay. So the cylinder would kind of pop out the side, mm-hmm. and you would shake the old cases out. Okay. And then walk me through, what does reloading look like?
Well, with a revolver, after you fired your last shot, you have to push the button and open the cylinder, have to hit the ejector rod, knock those out, and then you got to put 6 more rounds in there.
By hand?
By hand. And trying to do it one at a time takes time. And even people that had speed loaders, which is just a round cylinder with the 6 bullets snapped in them.
Okay.
Some guys carried
all 6 were together.
They were together, and you had to line them up and drop them in the cylinder, push the button. That made it a lot faster. But still, it took time.
Kind of a delicate operation.
Yes.
With these loose bullets, to do that, especially if you're being shot at.
Exactly. It's hard to concentrate on that whenever you're being shot at, because most of the time you don't realize what you're doing. And it all comes back to training. Mm-hmm. If you don't train with a process and practice with a process, it's going to be a big mess when it happens.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the culture in the 70s and 80s and police culture was this memory of an incident in 1970 in Newhall, California, where 4 California Highway Patrol officers were killed. They were all young officers. They were all new on the job. They all had revolvers, and at least the belief about what happened is that both pairs of officers were killed while reloading. And whether that actually happened that way or not, I mean, people aren't sure, but that's the belief.
It sounds very logical. If I'm not mistaken, the bad guys in that situation had semi-autos, or one of them did.
Yeah, I think so.
And the guys trying to reload the revolvers, the bad guy doesn't have to reload.
Nope. He can just keep pulling his trigger.
He can keep pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, it's hard to concentrate to do something when you're being shot at.
Yeah.
And that's if they were new officers, more than likely, like most officers, they don't consistently train.
Yeah.
And that's the worst part of it.
Well, there's so much else on the job to learn.
There is.
Besides shooting.
There
and
is.
I think that some people see a police officer who carries a gun every day and they think, oh, well, they shoot all the time. That's not necessarily true.
No, it's not. It's not.
There are some cops who are gun guys, and they do that recreationally. They take advantage of every training they can get. They love to shoot. But there are plenty of really good officers who they only shoot to qualify.
Exactly.
And that's the only time they shoot.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And the ones that really need to practice very seldom will go down to the range and practice. Mm-hmm. The ones that go down to the range and practice don't really need to.
Yeah.
Because they practice under different conditions and constantly.
Yeah.
So that they embed in their mind what to do and when to do it.
Right.
And the guys that don't practice, it just, I don't know.
Yeah.
I tried for several years to understand it, and I never could.
Okay. So the mindset is that there might be a fatal flaw with revolvers. At least that's the fear, that you'd get caught reloading, and even speed loaders didn't cut down that time too significantly. And so this is a feeling of being undergunned.
Yes, exactly.
Now, some years go by, you get into the 80s, start having departments that are buying these cheaper polymer guns like Glock. And Glocks are made in Europe, and they're although I think they're made here now, yeah. but they're an imported gun that is part plastic, part metal, and high capacity magazines, and supposedly very reliable, and I think Glock has proven that they are. But this is a new technology.
Yes.
And not everybody's on board with that, especially if you're a chief or some sort of commander that makes decisions about this, and you're not entirely comfortable with guns yourself, which I don't blame anybody for that. I mean, the psychology of, okay, I'm going to cause an explosion to happen right in front of my face. Mm-hmm. That's not a natural thing. And so some people really had to work to overcome that and be trained to be proficient in a revolver. And now you want to take the revolver away and replace it with a semi-auto.
Well, that's exactly why when we did make the transition over to semi-autos, that the people who wanted to keep the revolvers, they grandfathered them to be able to keep their revolvers.
Okay. So if they just did not want to make that transition, there were exceptions made for those who wanted to keep carrying a revolver.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. But when you were in a position, now this is in the 80s, probably getting into the late 80s, right? And you're asking, okay, we really ought to transition over and look at some other guns. How did the powers that be at that time, how did they receive that?
Well, our chief was very receptive. I was on the range at that time, and I contacted him because I had sample weapons from different manufacturers, and I contacted him and asked him to come down to the range and shoot some of them, and let him shoot them and showed him the speed of reloading with them, the effectiveness of the weapons, and he thought it was a good idea. He says, that's something that we need to do. and asked me to write up a proposal, which I did, and give it to him, and he approved it. And then we started the transition over to semi-automatics, which was a giant headache for me and my partner because we had to train everybody on the department with semi-autos.
Which some people probably were a bit resistant to, I'm sure.
Some were resistant, and like I say, there were a few that were grandfathered and retained their revolvers, which that was fine, but some of those people even came through our transitional training just to see what it was like.
Right, right.
But
were you able to win over some hearts and minds there?
We've won over a few that way, but there was probably 3 or 4 that were diehard revolver fans,
right?
And which that was fine. They were very proficient with their revolvers.
Okay.
And that's fine. If they felt more comfortable with it, we was all for it.
You also have, talking about the psychology behind it, this is before all weapons were purchased with uniform allowances. And so some of these older officers had bought that revolver with their own money.
Yes,
right?
All of them had. All of them. Everybody, when they went on the department, they bought their own weapon.
Okay, so there's an attachment there.
Yes, that's why they had a choice of 4 weapons at the time. And then,
do you recall what those 4 options were revolver-wise?
Revolver-wise, they could have a Smith & Wesson, a Colt, a Dan Wesson, or a Ruger.
Okay. And these are like a Smith & Wesson model 19.
19.
Okay.
Or,
so very traditional,
special.
very
Yes.
traditional looking black revolver.
Yep, and the Colt Trooper. And
okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then the 4 semi-autos that you looked at, do you remember what those were?
Yes, we had Beretta, Sig Sauer, Smith & Wesson, and Glock.
Beretta's probably what the Army picked, the M9.
Yes.
Okay.
The Army was carrying Berettas. We got the Sig, we got the Smith & Wesson, and the Glock. A lot of departments were using Smiths.
Okay.
A few departments were using SIGs, but a lot of departments was going to the Glock because it was a relatively new weapon and it had already proven itself.
Okay. Were these all 9mm?
Yes, they were all 9s, and later on they let them transition to 40s if they wanted to. They could carry a 9 or a 40, either one.
Okay. So now that's another factor in this because shortly after a lot of departments switched over to semi-autos, they, not universally, but in large part, switched over to 40 caliber. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of that comes from a different shootout that happened in the mid-'80s in Miami. What was the problem there? There were eight FBI agents, 2 assailants. They get in this shootout, and the assailant that kills 2 FBI agents and wounds 5 FBI agents was shot at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But what was the problem there?
Shot placement. I have seen, in my years on, I've seen almost as many people shot and killed with little 25s or even 22s.
Small bullets. Weak bullets, right.
It just depends on the placement of the shot.
Yeah.
You can shoot somebody certain places with huge guns, and it's not going to kill them.
Yeah.
Because it didn't hit the right place.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing is the shot placement.
Yeah. And when it hits, it needs to penetrate.
It needs to penetrate and expand.
Yeah. And that became something the FBI really got committed to after that shootout in Miami.
Yes.
They're like, look, we're going to make sure that our bullets go all the way in, a certain distance, even if it's through an arm or through part of a car or something else.
And through the clothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Because some of the bullets that they had designed back then, once it hit the clothing, they was done. They'd go through clothing, they wouldn't expand. They would fill up the hole in the front of the bullet, and the bullet wouldn't expand. And then it just defeats the purpose.
So the FBI's solution to this is a bigger bullet.
Bullet.
So they moved to a 10mm, and that may not sound like a lot from 9mm to 10, but if you saw them side by side, one's tiny and the other's gargantuan.
That's right.
And what was the problem though with the 10mm?
10mm was just, for most of them, it took too large of a gun, the frame of the gun, and the recoil.
Okay.
Most people couldn't handle the recoil on a big gun like that.
You talk about the psychology of an explosion going off in front of your face. A 10 millimeter is a notable explosion. Yes.
Most definitely.
And if you're anticipating that recoil, there's a common problem that happens if somebody with really any kind of gun, if they are anticipating that recoil, there's a mistake they can make. What is that?
It's going to jerk. You're going to dip the end of the gun down because you're anticipating it, and it's going to jerk on the trigger, and that's it's going to throw your shot off. It does every time.
Sure. And another problem with a reciprocating slide, with a slide that goes back and forth, that slide needs to be able to cycle all the way back and forward again.
That's correct.
What mistake do some shooters make with that kind of weapon?
They either hold the weapon too loosely in their hand, or they don't lock their wrist. They let their wrist come back, and if that comes back, that takes away from the recoil spring, and the slide won't come back, and it causes a stovepipe or causes a stoppage or a jam in it.
So the empty shell doesn't come out all the way.
All the way.
Because you weren't holding the gun strongly enough.
Right.
But both of those problems, slapping the trigger, a limp wrist, both those problems come from being afraid of the recoil and being afraid of the gun going off.
And not most of it, and not being experienced with it.
Right.
Some people just don't have the strength in their wrist and hand to hold the gun securely. Especially a lighter gun.
And the solution, though, non-intuitively, is what?
Well, the solution to that is a lot of practice or get a heavier gun.
A heavier gun?
A heavier gun. If you've got a heavier gun, the gun itself is going to take up some of the recoil.
Its own inertia
takes care of it. Its own inertia will be taking up some of it, and that makes it a lot easier.
If you have a smaller shooter, a person who is smaller, male or female, but they're a smaller person, and they're not holding the gun strongly enough, my intuition would say, well, give them a lighter gun, give them a smaller gun, but actually that's not the way to fix it.
That's not the way to fix it. That's the wrong way to go.
So the 10 millimeter, big bullet, maybe a little too big. All right. What was FBI's solution after the 10 millimeter?
They went back to the 40s. And since they carried 40s for a long time, and then they switched back to 9s. And the biggest majority of the departments now are carrying 9s.
Yes. And now, but what's the difference between a 9 millimeter round 40 years ago versus now? I mean, there's been some technological improvements, right?
Yes. The 9s now, they've done a lot of improvements, technology on bullet expansion. They've tested different bullets through glass, through clothing, different articles, coats, and they've developed bullets that will still penetrate that and then expand after it gets in.
So the idea that a 9 millimeter is not a big enough round to penetrate or to get through certain barriers is probably not true anymore.
No,
technology-wise,
it'll get through, and like I say, it all goes back to shot placement.
So ultimately, marksmanship. Whatever gun you're carrying,
exactly.
You need to be able to put rounds on the target.
Exactly.
Well, that's fantastic. So some officers resisted this, but most of them got on board, and they could pick between these different semi-autos. This is in the late 80s. How long did that last that they could pick whatever kind of semi-auto they wanted?
That only lasted about, we started the transitional training in July. They had up until, I think it was August, sometime in August, that they had to determine for sure what they wanted.
And this is 88?
88. 89.
89?
89, yes.
Eventually, though, that became standardized.
Yes.
Where does that decision come from?
That comes from the chief.
So a chief came in, and he wanted everyone carrying the same gun. What's the logic there?
His logic at the time, that's when they changed over to where everybody had to get Glocks. The department was buying Glocks for him, and he wanted everybody to look the same.
Well, looking the same seems very important.
He thought so.
Sorry.
He thought so, and he was the chief. He wanted everybody
that's his prerogative.
to be uniform and to look the same.
Okay.
And one of his reasoning was that if two officers got into a shootout and one of them run out of ammunition, the other officer could throw in one of his magazines and he could keep on shooting.
Now, wait. A Glock 17 has how many rounds in the magazine?
They usually have 15 to 17, depending on the magazines.
Okay. And you carry 2 or 3 magazines, presumably.
Most of them did carried at least 2 and sometimes 3.
Okay, so your partner shot 50 shots, and the problem's not solved yet. Now he wants to take one of your magazines. Are you giving it to him?
No. Because he's already proved to me that he can't hit what he's shooting at. I'll guard him while he leaves, but he's not getting my bullets.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's awesome. Okay, now let me go back to the chief thing. You made the transition from revolvers to semi-autos, and the chief had to approve that. Your chief came down and shot it and said, hey, this is a great idea. But a lot of times these processes take a long time. But in your case, it actually was hurried. Why did that happen?
Because our chief told me, when I presented it to him, to write up a proposal for this transition and get it to him because he was about to retire. And he said, if you don't get it approved before I retire, you may not get it at all.
Okay.
So I wrote it up, give it to him.
He was savvy about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Because you can't count on the next chief, because a chief's been in law enforcement for 20 or 30 years already.
Right.
And that means were trained on an older system. That's what they're comfortable with.
And they don't want change.
Yeah.
They don't want change. That's a problem with any agency. Most of them are resistant to any kind of change.
Yeah. So you have to factor that in. I mean, I'm sure there are gun guys in police departments right now that are thinking, hey, we need to do this. We need a different holster. We need a different gun. We need a different ammunition. And they can't communicate that to their chief or to the powers that be. They can't get it up the chain of command because the chain of command, we're used to what came before.
Yes.
And they may not be receptive to changing that.
Exactly. They don't like change, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And, of course, a lot of them are afraid of liability.
Sure.
They're afraid something's going to happen.
You don't want to make a mistake.
That's right.
When something else is already tried and true.
That's right. They're afraid, something might happen, then we're going to be liable. And they're just resistant because of a lot of reasons.
Okay. And so the chief pushed that through, and you switched over to semi-auto.
Yes.
4 years later, a different chief says, we're going to switch over to Glocks. So everybody's carrying the same make of gun. All right. And so everybody that wasn't grandfathered in is moving over to the very same thing. And then we see another 25 years go by, and Glocks are still prevalent, probably the most common law enforcement gun out there right now. But you're saying that the switch is now from 40 caliber to 9 millimeter, a little smaller, more controllable round that has better technology than it used to have.
A little smaller, more controllable, has good technology, and you have more round capacity in your magazines.
Oh, yeah.
Because it is a smaller bullet.
Yeah, the 40 cals weren't carrying 17 rounds. They were carrying a dozen or so, maybe.
Because the 9 is being smaller, you get more rounds in a magazine.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
It makes sense.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you coming in and talking to me about this.
No problem. Glad to do it.
Thank you. The story of transitioning from revolvers to semi-autos isn't really a gun story. It's actually a story about overcoming change within a department. And cops hate change just about the same amount that they hate not changing. It really all depends on where their attachments are. The fact that these officers had invested time in learning one type of gun, a gun that can be challenging for some to learn, and then they had to pay for it with their own money, meant that some of those officers were never going to give up that revolver, no matter what statistics or arguments you might try to make. Fighting for change in these kind of scenarios might feel like an impossible task. In the case of KCKPD, having a chief who was willing to push through a big change before he retired was critical to making that transition happen when it did. But if you're a leader who is not about to retire, it's understandable that you might pump the brakes before you hang your entire career and reputation on a new and unfamiliar technology that might not pan out. The rest of us should stop and consider how to sell a new idea to a leader who is in that position. It might take some nudging and some hands-on education, or maybe a field trip to see another department who has adopted the change already. It can be done, but that natural dynamic that fears the unfamiliar and becomes more risk-adverse as the investment increases, that human element will always be there. I love talking to Paul Bowman about guns and law enforcement, and I wish I had recorded our banter as we prepared for the interview. All of it was pure gold. If you liked hearing from Paul, you can hear him talking about police cars in a previous episode of the Hey Chaplain podcast. That's bonus episode 2, which was released on September 27th, 2021. If you liked what you heard here, please share this episode with a cop or someone who loves a cop. I also want to give a shout out to my listeners in South Carolina. It's not the largest group of listeners that I have, but when I check my statistics early in the morning on a day that a new episode drops, there's always a group of South Carolina downloads in a couple of towns that are first in line. And I'm just really delighted by that there are listeners, I don't even know who you are, but here you are downloading the episodes, first in line, every time. And I really appreciate it. Thank you. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
Well, initially, I learned how to do that in Harris County when we had the trial for Jesse Valdez, the gal that killed him. I was with the family. We had a 2-week trial every single day, Wow. So I was with the family from actually picking them up at their house, getting them to the courthouse, getting them through the line of people going in the building, making sure the media didn't shove microphones in their faces and that sort of thing, sitting with them in the courtroom, walking them to the bathroom. So once again, they didn't get attacked by media, trying to catch them at a, just out of the blue.
The views expressed here are the personal views of the hosts and our guests and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. Thank you for listening today, and as always, pray for peace in our city.